Welcome, everyone. My name's Stephen Riel, and this panel is called Queer Literary Hookups, Gauging the impact of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered writers on our work, both past writers and current writers. Our lineup today is very different from the one that we originally had set up. Franklin Abbott from Atlanta wasn't able to join us today, but he was able to get quite a replacement. Judy Grande has joined us instead. So thank you, Judy, for that.
You're welcome.
And Brian Rigg is here and was on a panel with me this morning, but he's unfortunately become very ill in the past 2 hours, and he's not able to be here, which is a real disappointment for me. And I know that the reason that Brian is here is to present on this panel. So I'll just briefly introduce Julie and Judy. Julie Enszer's scholarly work has appeared or is forthcoming in Southern Cultures, Journal of Lesbian Studies, American Periodicals, WSQ, and Frontiers. Her work, A Fine Bind, is a history of lesbian feminist presses, 1969 to 2009, and her poetry titles include Avowed, Lilith's Demon, Sisterhood, and Handmade Love. She's the editor of the complete works of Pat Parker, which did win the 2017 Lambda Literary Award for Lesbian Poetry, and Milk and Honey, a celebration of Jewish lesbian poetry, which was a finalist in 2012 for the Lambda Award. Julie edits and publishes Sinister Wisdom, a well-known periodical, and is book reviewer for The Rumpus and Calyx. Judy Grande is internationally known as a foremother of cultural feminism and the gay liberation movement. Her iconic work includes A Woman is Talking to Death, The Common Women Poems, Another Mother Tongue, Blood, Bread, and Roses, etc. And she's recently come out with a poetry publication, Hanging on Our Own Bones. And the Judy Grande Reader is here up front in front of Judy. It's a primer that's used for in classrooms and by researchers. And she has a new collection of short stories forthcoming as well. So we will go ahead, and Julie's agreed to begin, and then Judy, and then myself.
All right, and you need to introduce yourself,
Okay.
Stephen. Tell us all about yourself.
I'm Stephen. I'm a poet. I live in Massachusetts. This is my first full-length book of poetry that came out from Trio House Press. I have 3 chapbooks as well, one of which was selected by Robin Becker as the runner-up for her inaugural Robin Becker Chapbook Prize. It's called Postcard from P-Town. My poems have been published in numerous anthologies and periodicals, and I'm currently the editor-in-chief of a new Franco-American literary journal, e-journal, Résonance, which just had its first issue published.
Okay.
Yeah. So, Julie.
All right, thanks for coming. I'm just going to dive right in. I have some written remarks. There is all around us this country of original fire. You know what I mean. The sky, after all, stops at nothing, so something has to be holding our bodies in its rich and timeless stables, or else we would fly away. Off Stellwagen, off the coast, the humpbacks rise, carrying their tonnage of barnacles and joy. They leap through the water, they nuzzle back under it like children at play. I know a whale that will come to the boat whenever she can and nudge it gently along the bow with her long flipper. I know several lives worth living. Listen, whatever it is you try to do with your life, nothing will ever dazzle you like the dreams of your body, its spirit longing to fly while the dead weight bones toss their dark mane and hurry back into the fields of glittering fire, where everything, even the great whale, throbs with song. These are the opening and closing lines of Mary Oliver's Humpbacks from her Pulitzer Prize-winning collection, American Primitive. And my comments this morning are really a pastiche, an opportunity to read the words of writers that I love dearly, and Oliver's one of them. For years, I read Oliver's sensuousness, her pleasure and joy in the body as lesbian, long before she acknowledged publicly being a lesbian. The lesbian sexuality in her work encoded as a genderless universal. Unlike in the work of Marilyn Hacker, Hacker's book-length sonnet sequence, Love, Death, and the Changing of the Seasons, contains this sonnet. First, I want to make you come in my hand while I watch you and kiss you, and if you cry, I'll drink your tears, while with my whole hand I hold your drenched loveliness contracting, and after a breath, I want to make you full again and wet. I want to make you come in my mouth like a storm. No tears now. The sum of your parts is my whole, most beautiful chart of constellations, your left breast in my mouth again. You know you'll have to be your age as I lie beside you. Cover me like a gold cloud, hands everywhere. At last, inside me, where I trust you, then your tongue where I need you. I want you to make me come. I learned about lesbian sex by reading, one hand holding a book, the other between my legs. In my pantheon of writers, lesbian sexuality was something that infused a lifetime, as Audre Lorde writes about meeting Tony in her biomythography, Zammy. Lorde writes, suddenly I realized that there was a little creature standing on a step in the entryway of the main doors, looking at me with bright eyes and a big smile. It was a little girl. She was right away the most beautiful little girl I had ever seen alive in my life. My lifelong dream of a doll baby come to life, in fact, had come true. What's your name? Mine's Tony. From around her neck hung a fluffy white fur muff that matched the white fur ball on top of her hat. I touched her muff too, and then raised my hand up to feel the fur pom-pom. The soft, silky warmth of the fur made my fingers tingle in a way that the cold had not, and I pinched and fingered it until Tony finally shook her head free of my hand. I stuck both of my hands into the holes of her furry muff, and she giggled delightedly as my cold fingers closed around her arms, one inside the dark quilted spaces of the fur. She pulled one hand out past mine and opened it in front of my face to reveal 2 peppermint lifesavers, sticky now from the heat of her palm. Want one? I still crave sticky peppermint lifesavers warmed by a woman's palm. Scent was a guide to Minnie Bruce Pratt as well. Pratt wrote in the last 3 stanzas of her poem on Sugarloaf Key, Jane knew Barbara across the width of a mob's curses by the back of her head. I would know your hip motion, your alternate strong haunches walking and at night. If I came back to bed in the leaf-sided light, the air ripe with night's water and the sun, if I lay close with closed eyes, I would know you by smell, the roused dirt, the earliest water, my face near the earliest smell. Jane in the poem is Jane Verlaine, and her lover Barbara is Barbara Deming. Deming will appear again in a spell. But, as I discovered, lesbian sexuality is not all divinely scented, orgasmic, and sticky sweet. Minnie Bruce Pratt reminds us in her poetic memoir, She-He, lesbian love has endings, painful endings that often blend with joyful beginnings. Pratt writes, later over the phone, back in your city far away, you tell me, when I first kissed you, I felt how you protected your heart. You say, I'm coming back to kiss you again. You will open your mouth to me, and I will touch your heart with my tongue. The invisible mark your lips, teeth, tongue will leave on me. By the time we have this conversation, the marks on my neck, the bruises are fading. I have called my other lover to tell her I am never coming to her bed again. That last sentence still strikes pain in my heart. And Marilyn Hacker also echoes the precarity of love in the closing quatrain of her poem, Going Back to the River. She writes, "Love's not forever, life is precarious. Wherever I live, let me come home to you as you are, I as I am, where you meet me and walk with me to the river." Now, I've frittered away 2/3 of my time talking about love and sex, and I do not want to miss politics. It was Edna St. Vincent Millay who first opened a window to me into gender politics with her lines, "I, being born a woman and distressed by all the needs and notions of my kind, am urged by your propinquity to find your person fair and feel a certain zest to bear your body's weight upon my breast." She concludes this sonnet, "I shall remember you with love or season my scorn with pity. Let me make it plain. I find this frenzy insufficient reason for conversation when we meet again." Adrienne Rich, in the political vein, is the writer who helped me to ask hard questions. In some of the stanzas in The Spirit of Place, a poem of hers written during the 1970s, she wrote, "It was not enough to be for abolition while the spirit of the masters flickered in the abolitionist's heart. It was not enough to name ourselves anew while the spirit of the masters calls the freed woman to forget the slave. With whom do you believe your lot is cast? If there's a conscience in these hills, it hurls that question, unquenched, relentless to our ears, wild and witch-like, ringing from every swamp. With whom do you believe your lot is cast? I cast mine with Rich, Pat Parker, Audre Lorde. As Lorde concludes Need, a chorale for Black women's voices with these lines. The simplest parts of this poem is the truth in each one of us to which it is speaking. How much of this truth can I bear to see and still live unblended? How much of this pain can I use? We cannot live without our lives. The final line, a quotation from Barbara Deming, quoted by Audre Lorde, we cannot live without our lives. Of course, Judy Grande is another writer who looms large in my imagination. In her poem, A History of Lesbianism, she explores how they came into the world, the women-loving women. They made love to each other the best they knew how, and for the best reasons. Though the goodness of Grande's history of lesbianism concludes with the reality of conflict, it ends. The subject of lesbianism is very ordinary. It's the question of male domination that makes everybody angry. I often ask myself alone in my writing studio, what am I doing today to make everybody angry? I often conclude not enough. And I want to end with the words of Irina Klepfish. And like all the matriarchs, the wives and daughters, the sisters and aunts, the nieces, the keepers of button shops, milliners, seamstresses, peddlers of foul fish, of matches, of rotten apples, laundresses, midwives, floor washers, and street cleaners who rushed exhausted all week so that Shabbos could be observed with fresh challah on the table, who argued in the common tongue and begged for the daughter run off to the revolution and the daughter run off with the shegets, who refused to sit Shiva and say Kaddish for a living child, who always begged for life, who understood the accounts but saw them differently, who knew the power of human laws, knew they always counted, no matter what the revolution or the party or the state, who knew the power of words, who cried whole lifetimes for their runaway children, for the husbands immobilized by the written word, for the brothers grown callous from usury, for the uncle grown indifferent from crime, from bargaining, from chiseling, from Jewing them down. Like these, my despised ancestors, I have become a keeper of accounts. Thank you for inviting me to keep accounts today.
You want me to go next? Yes. I'm assuming that Stephen wrote the description of this workshop, and I really appreciated it. Did furtively devouring Audre Lorde's steamy lyrics in the library stacks make us the writers we are? LGBTQ authors plumb how queer literary ancestors and present-day companions influence what we create. So I was invited to fill in for Franklin Abbott, and I want to pay homage to an ancestor of mine who is of Frank Kameny, or Franklin Edward Kameny, who isn't well known enough. I think he is such a forefather, and he definitely influenced me. I'll tell you how I knew him. I was 24 years old and looking for anything that would help my lover and I to lead actual lives in the society. We just looked everywhere, and we couldn't find anything. I was living in Washington, D.C., and I'm fortunate enough to go to a lecture in New York by Paul Goodman, who was a liberal philosopher, theorist of the day, and he told people about Mattachine Society, which I hadn't known anything about. And there was, that organization was working for gay and lesbian rights, and there was a chapter of it in Washington, D.C. So we went and we joined it. Mattachine was first founded by a fellow named Harry Hay back in 1949. He was a cultural worker and a communist and a controversial figure, I must say. But he got a cultural arm of LGBT rights started, and then the political people came and they said, no, we want Mattachine to be very, very political and not cultural. So Mattachine Group, which would be about maybe 15, 20 people sitting on chairs in a room, and we were expected to try to normalize ourselves so that we would be acceptable to the society. But the meetings were generally run by Frank Kameny. He co-founded it in 1961. And I'll tell you a little about him. I ended up in that organization attending the first picket of the White House and holding one of those, one of the signs that are now in the Smithsonian Museum in honor of Kameny and everything he did, and of that first picket in front of the White House. I didn't know him in any sense of being friends, though I did attend a party with him at one point, but mostly I just knew him as an older person who was born in 1925. I was born in 1940. He was known as an American gay rights activist because in 1957, he was dismissed from his position as an astronomer in the U.S. Army's map service in Washington because of his homosexuality. and, quote, this leading him to begin a Herculean struggle with the American establishment. I mean, his whole life became radicalized, and he was just an arrow through the air, and he was a flaming arrow. He formally appealed his firing, and this was unsuccessful, but it was the first known civil rights claim based on sexual orientation in any U.S. court. He was born to Ashkenazi Jewish parents in New York City, graduated from high school in 1941. At the age of 16, went to Queens College, learned physics. At age 17, told his parents that he was an atheist. He was drafted into the Army and served, and then came out and he was a teaching fellow at Harvard University. He was very conventional. But on a cross-country return trip from Tucson, where he was researching his PhD thesis, he was arrested by a plainclothes police officer in a San Francisco bus terminal after a stranger had approached and groped him. In other words, he was entrapped. They spotted him as a possible gay man, and they had somebody grope him, and then they arrested him, right? This was a tactic, and it was used in the Army as well, to entrap people. They're probably still doing it somewhere. So he was promised that his criminal record would be expunged after serving 3 years probation. Can you imagine this? Relieving him from worrying about his employment prospects. Relocating, he taught for a year in the astronomy department of Georgetown University, and he was hired by the United States Army Map Service. When they learned of his arrest in San Francisco, his superiors questioned him, but he refused to tell them anything regarding his sexual orientation. He was then fired soon afterward, and then he was barred from any future employment by the federal government. He was the most conventional of men, focused utterly on his work at Harvard and so on. But he was so rudely shocked that he became completely radicalized. He appealed his firing through the judicial system, losing twice, and it went all the way up to asking for a review from the United States Supreme Court. And then he devoted himself ever after that to activism. He never held a paid job again. He was supported by friends and family for the rest of his life. And despite his outspoken activism, he rarely discussed his personal life and never had any long-term relationships with other men, which explains what I knew about him, stating merely that he had no time for them. Then in 1961, he and a man named Jack Nichols, who is still alive, co-founded the Washington, D.C. branch of the Mattachine Society and launched some of the earliest public protests by gays and lesbians with a picket line at the White House on April 17th, 1965, in coalition with New York's Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis, which had been founded by another one of my elders, the great Barbara Giddings. And the two of them, always I will have such admiration, but I also want to just tell you how Tammany influenced me. But let me go on for some of the things that he did. That with Mattachine, he launched a campaign to overturn DC's sodomy laws. This was 1963. The bill finally passed in 1993. So it's about be patient. And he also worked mightily to remove the classification of homosexuality as a mental disorder from the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Let me tell you, this is why any of us are able to have lovers and not be continually threatened with psychiatric incarceration, basically. In 71, he became the first openly gay candidate for the United States Congress. And following his defeat, he and his organization created the Gay and Lesbian Alliance of Washington, D.C. And in 1972, Kameny and Barbara Giddings together convinced the American Psychiatric Association to hold a debate, and it was called Psychiatry, Friend or Foe to the Homosexual, a dialogue at their annual meeting. And in this debate, a gay psychiatrist who was in disguise, as all of us were in the early days, didn't even use our own names, probably even in Mattachine. But this psychiatrist testified as to how homosexuality, being listed as a mental disease, affected the lives of gay psychiatrists. You can imagine. I, who am a crazy gay person, am treating you, my client. Kameny had approached numerous gay psychiatrists, but only this one person, Fryer, Johnny Fryer, was the only one who agreed to testify, and only in disguise for fear of losing his position at Temple University, where he did not have tenure. And the following year, the APA removed homosexuality from the DSM, and Kameny described that day, December 15th, 1973, as the day, quote, "we were cured en masse by the psychiatrists." He also went after the Marines to try to change what was happening there, finding the exact right person to do this. And in 1977, under the leadership of the Gay Task Force, they briefed a public liaison on much-needed changes in federal laws and policies. And it was the first time that gay rights were officially discussed at the White House. In 2007, the Smithsonian Institution, National Museum of American History, included his picket signs, and there are 12 of them, for the White House 1965 picket in the Smithsonian exhibit, as I told you earlier. But Kameny died in 2011. Among other honors, his home has been designated historic landmark in the District of Columbia. He, the director of the Office of Personnel Management, I don't know exactly, on behalf of the United States government, apologized to Kameny himself. The DuPont Circle Advisory Neighborhood Commission unveiled a new street sign designating 17th Street between P&R Northwest as Frank Kameny Way in his honor. He was honored with a humanitarian award from Cornelius R. Neil Alexander was the name of the award in 2010. President Barack Obama signed the Don't Ask, Don't Tell Repeal Act of 2010, and Kameny was invited to attend. He was a member of Triangle Foundation's Board of Advisors. In addition, giant rainbow flag on a tall flagpole at the corner of Market Street in Castro, in the Castro neighborhood of San Francisco, which was a very gay neighborhood, was flown at half-staff for 24 hours on the day after following his death. Something called the Minor Planet had something of Frank Kameny. It was named, the planet itself was named Frank Kameny in honor of his astronomy career that was cut so short. So that happened, and he was inducted into the Legacy Walk of LGBT people. He also received a U.S. Veterans Administration Memorial Headstone in the Congressional Cemetery at his memorial site. In front of that headstone lays a marker inscribed with the slogan, "Gay is good." Kameny coined that slogan, and in a 2009 AP interview said that about coining it, quote, "If I'm remembered for anything, I hope it will be that." So how I knew Frank Kameny was as a very young and very naive person, knowing nothing whatever about activism, just desperate for any kind of change, and sitting in the meetings with these people who were talking about mysterious things that didn't seem to have much to do with me, about restoring rights through the legal system and so on. And I was wanting to be a poet and have my teacher lover be able to be out, which never did happen. She died before anything like that could happen. So the two of us were in that organization, but Kameny came in that spring and joining all of us to do everything that we could to overturn the psychiatric evaluation of us. And I came to understand that there were not just military and police walls that were walling us in, but that the psychiatric establishment was also walling us in. And even after I finished doing the picket and then attended a few more meetings and then dropped out to do my own work, that first work tells me everything about how influenced I was by Frank. That the very first thing I wrote was published in Sexology magazine. I wrote it under a pseudonym. It was published the following year. I never even saw the magazine, but I knew it was being published. I got $50 for it, a phenomenal sum of money, especially for the very first thing you wrote. And I now hardly can recognize the person who wrote this, because it was a tract about lesbians wanting marriage and gay men just wanting to have all kinds of sex, which was a stereotype of sorts, true and not true at the same time, right? And then saying that not all lesbians are crazy, and that crazy people might be drawn to our movement. So it was awful. It was a very, shall we say, primitive attempt to cope with these ideas that were all just so new to me. But the second thing I wrote was more to the point. It was called The Psychoanalysis of Edward the Dyke, because after I was thrown out of the service and radicalized by that for being a lesbian, I had been treated by a psychiatrist who wanted me to assimilate as a straight person, and I had to decide to leave that I would take the category crazy, thank you very much, if this is what it meant, because there was no way, there wasn't anything straight in me or about me. And that piece then satirized both the psychiatrist and myself, and it's still in print, it's still being used and taught. So I wanted to pay my respects to him and Barbara Giddings as well. The picket line was excruciating to be in, and the reason was not only that I was stunned to be holding, a picket sign and being so public all of a sudden with something. It was totally new to me. There wasn't anything like that I had ever participated in. But secondly, because we were trying to be assimilated in some way, we had to dress in gender-specific clothing, which I never did. I had occupations that enabled me to wear a uniform, but that was like, nurse drag or waitress drag, And the rest of the time, Yvonne and I ran around in Levi's and tennis shoes, and I didn't even have laces in my tennis shoes. But now we had to go buy me a skirt and a blouse and some shoes, and the shoes were not made very well. They understatement, they were very badly made, and they cut my feet. so that I couldn't even finish the picket. I had to drop out after the White House, and the rest of the gang went all the way to the Pentagon. Nevertheless, it was a great day, a great moment, and put together by a great man, who's Frank Kameny.
Thank you. Well, interestingly enough, both Frank Kameny and Judy Grande figure in my my little story here.
okay.
So imagine me, 16 years old, sitting in my senior English class in a New England prep school. I had just begun a romantic relationship with another boy back in my hometown, over the mountain. A month earlier, at the end of summer, where we were changing into our costumes for a theater production, I'd seen him standing in his briefs at the other end of the boys' room, and I thought in an adult sort of way, I want that. By autumn, we were writing love letters back and forth. His letters were over the top of Wagnerian, written with a fountain pen on blue onion skin, sprinkled with cologne. So at the same time in class, we were assigned Moby Dick, and in chapter 4, I encountered this passage. Upon waking next morning about daylight, I found Queequeg's arm thrown over me in the most loving and affectionate manner. You had almost thought I had been his wife. For though I tried to move his arm, unlock his bridegroom clasp, yet sleeping as he was, he still hugged me tightly, as though naught but death should us part twain. Death should part us twain. My teenaged antennas tried to compute this. Why was Melville depicting a scene in which homosexuality was implicitly referred to? I would have liked to have been in Queequeg's arms. Was that also true of Melville? Was he inside the closet but publicly exploring his fantasy, approaching but not crossing the line? Next up, in the poetry anthology assigned to the class, I encountered this poem by Audre Lorde Tennyson, Fatima, in which a Moorish woman speaks. Here are 2 stanzas. Last night, when someone spoke his name, from my swift blood that went and came, 1,000 little shafts of flame were shivered in my narrow frame. O love, O fire, once he drew with one long kiss my whole soul through, my lips as sunlight drinketh dew. My whole soul waiting silently, all naked in a sultry sky, droops blinded with his shining eye. I will possess him or will die. I will grow round him in his place, grow, live, die looking on his face, die dying clasped in his embrace. All right, again, my teenaged gaydar word. How could a man write so passionately about another man? Was the poet using the female speaker as a mask, a strategy for saying what he really wanted to say? There was no one with whom I could share these suspicions. Fast forward 3 years, I'm in a Victorian literature class at Georgetown that was taught by my favorite professor, a super smart feminist. We were discussing the importance of being earnest, trying with, I'm sure, the best intentions to be tolerant and open-minded. Our professor announced, I don't care if Oscar Wilde was homosexual. Do any of you? I was stunned, but was too timid still to speak up. But, I wanted to sputter. How could we understand what he was doing as an artist if we ignored that how he was satirizing the British upper class was informed by why, as a queer, he was satirizing it? Archness and camp soaked every moment in that play in heavy syrup. By then I was working part-time at Lambda Rising Bookstore, where I wrote brief descriptions of books for an incipient mail order catalog. There, I searched for and found books by gay poets. I met local poets Ed Cox and Chasen Gaver. I read Gay Sunshine, Fag Rag, Mouth of the Dragon, Christopher Street. I encountered this poem by the San Francisco beat poet Harold Norse, whose frank expression of desire I found extremely liberating. So the poem is called You Must Have Been a Sensational Baby, and here's a section of it. A pair of muscular calves drove me crazy today. I studied their size, their shape, their sun-tanned hairiness. I spoke to the owner of them. Are you a dancer? I asked. Oh no, I was born with them, he said. You must have been a sensational baby, I said. He went back to the newspaper. I went back to his calves. At Lambda Rising, I also found the books of poets whose work I was too young and uneducated to take in fully. Auden, James Merrill, and even Ginsberg. As for Auden, I didn't have the broad knowledge of the history and art of poetry required to perceive what he attempted and achieved. In the case of Ginsberg, I was only beginning to shed some of my prissy, sheltered Roman Catholic New England upbringing. His rant seemed crude and prosaic. I didn't have enough knowledge to appreciate the scope and roots of his rebellion, nor the Jewish liturgy with which he dialogued. I couldn't appreciate James Merrill's magnum opus, The Changing Light of Sandover, until I had read Dante's Divine Comedy. As a young man, when I heard Merrill give a reading at Harvard, I had to turn off the sense-making part of my mind and simply take in his exquisitely modulated wash of sounds. After the reading, I walked across Massachusetts Avenue to Grolier Poetry Bookshop and found him alone in a corner waiting to sign books. We looked in each other's eyes. So you're a poet, he began. I never felt more humble nor more appreciative of another gay man's sweet generosity. For 2 decades, these 3 poets' books sat on my shelf, holding more possible answers to the question, how can one be a gay poet? My early search for answers, of course, took place alongside studying the conventional canon in the extremely traditional English program at Georgetown. We read Milton's Paradise Lost twice in 4 years. Only later would I appreciate how Jesuit Georgetown Catholicism influenced its curriculum. As an undergraduate, I did not understand the silent politics of canons, of intellectual hegemony. So when some of my classmates and I were encouraged in our senior year to apply for Rhodes scholarships, and I proposed in my application to spend a year studying British gay literature, I flew smack into the discouragement and even anger of my professors. You are wasting your talent by being so open. I'm only telling you this because I care about you, the department chairman counseled. Noel Coward's lyrics and Auden's poems were so good because they didn't specify the sex of the beloved. Besides, everyone knew, said another professor disdainfully. But I wasn't interested in a closeted study of literature, nor in writing coded poems. I was interested in speaking the love's name. Almost immediately, I began writing openly gay poetry and having it published in campus literary magazines. Probably this was easier since I was a public leader of the campus gay and lesbian student group, which was moving towards suing the university for discrimination, and how I met Frank Camedy, who was very instrumental in getting the DC human rights law passed, which was the statute that the lawsuit was founded on or relied on. My college poetry teacher remarked that my gay poems possessed greater energy, and I could feel that too. Then Mouth of the Dragon took one of those poems and through editor Andrew Bifrost's letters, typewritten with an unusual blue ribbon, I was linked to gay literature in the adult world. Two formative pieces of critical writing that I discovered at Lambda Rising, which were Robert K. Martin's The Homosexual Tradition in American Poetry and an essay in Gay Sunshine by Rudy Kickel about contemporary gay poets, provided context about what my predecessors had achieved. I immediately valued a sense of lineage, of literary brotherhood. From the start, I considered my work to be in a dialogue with earlier gay writers and as a part of the other canon. It's important to acknowledge that my presumption that this was the case relied on unconscious white privilege, on an assumption of belonging that could not come so easily to others. However, my strongest influences in my formative years turned out to be women. In those days, it was often women who created the space where queer men could emerge into consciousness. Adrienne Rich's The Dream of a Common Language changed my life and influenced my poetry. I sought out and savored every word of hers and reviewed her new books. Her 21 love poems showed me how to write openly about being in a gay relationship within an oppressive society. Susan Griffin's Women in Nature provided me with an example of a large structure that could support an extended meditation. The poems of Judy Grande and Audre Lorde showed me many rhetorical strategies for turning the tables on oppression and demonstrated the permissibility of expressing justified anger. I must not leave out the profound influence that the often forgotten poet Kenneth Pitchford, the partner of feminist writer Robin Morgan, had on me as a young poet. His book, Color Photos of the Atrocities, published in 1973, includes a section called Effeminist Inklings. Just the fact of its existence helped me to make a commitment to write honestly about my effeminacy, a project that eventually took shape as a series called 13 Ways of Looking at My Effeminacy. Pitchford's poem, The Flaming Faggots, trumpeted a revolution in which gay men joined feminists in transformative rebellion, and this is a quote from that poem. It's time we said yes, yes to faggot, proud to reclaim our martyrs. Who else will have them or feel their pain? But we brother lovers, we flaming faggots who embrace the coal of final rebellion, women already ablaze, we catching fire from them this time, a whole planet groaning with relief as the bonds of an expiring masculinity glow like wicks, then break, slipping from our backs. In that holocaust, I will risk my whole self and body, even should I perish. When I look back at those gay poets who later on primarily influenced my work, a consistent theme emerges. The work of D.A. Powell, David Trinidad, Wayne Kirstenbaum, C.A. Conrad, and Paul Manette each expanded the sphere of my liberation and my willingness to be fully out in new ways in my work. In closing, I must circle back to the beginning. In my late 40s, I returned to school and earned a master's degree in poetry. And for my critical thesis, I wrote about how Alfred Lord Tennyson used female masks to express what he could not say in Victorian England about his love for Arthur Henry Hallam. While I undertook this literary investigation and case-proving, the poet in me learned a great deal from Tennyson as a craftsman and a creative soul. Eventually, I went to Lincoln, England, and delivered my paper at an international symposium that celebrated the bicentenary of his birth. The more deeply I study Tennyson's work and life, the more convinced I am of what I recognized when reading Fatima in the 12th grade, that one of the English language's most accomplished poets was constantly tapping out code from inside the closet. One item on my bucket list as a writer is to have my essay on Tennyson published, to help liberate scholarship's misguided understanding of him and to claim him as one of our forefathers. Thank you. So we have plenty of time to open this up, and I'm wondering two things. I'm wondering if people here have questions for each other, panelists, questions for each other, audience members, but I'm wondering if members of the audience would like to speak a little bit about writers who influence you. John.
I'm not going to directly answer the question you just asked, so I will indulge me in some personal privilege. I just want to say what a wonderful panel this has been, and I'm just sorry there aren't more attendees here to enjoy this. So thank you all for sharing your remarks. I especially want to acknowledge Judy and say what a thrill it is to be in your presence. I think of you as a pioneer, and I hope you don't mind that label, but I think of you as a pioneer along with Del Martin, Phyllis Line, Sally Gerhardt, all of whom I had the honor of meeting at one point in the past, and it's nice to see you here. So thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your reminiscences, and also for reminding us of Frank's story.
Yes. Yeah. You're quite welcome. Yeah.
It's open. Anyone? Questions? Influences you want to talk about? Judy, you talked about Frank, but you didn't talk about writers who have influenced you. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
I'd have to go back to my childhood, but certainly my second choice for this panel would have been Gertrude Stein, who was closeted in her work, allegedly, but not in her life. When she lived with her lover, a relatively open life in the south of France and in Paris. But the story that I would have told about her would start with a lit class that I was required to take in high school. It must have been the junior year probably, or could have even been senior year. And the literature textbook had a piece by Stein called Miss Fur and Miss Skeen that was all about being very gay, that Miss Fur and Miss Skeen were very gay. They were very, very gay. They were gayer every day. And every day they were gay in more and more ways of being gay. And then they sat together with others who were gay, men who were gay. They sat together. They sat together in a public place with men who were gay, and they learned more and more ways about being gay, and they were gayer and gayer and gayer. And it goes on for pages of this, hundreds of times that she uses this word. And it was in my high school literature textbook, which would be 1957 or 1958 at the latest. And or it might even have been a little earlier than that, and no one, of course, had any clue, no idea what she was talking about. It wasn't until much later that I was looking at her again, because I go to her, she's a well for me, and I go to her for a well. And when I'm stuck or I want something new with language, because she just decomposed the English language and put it together in a brand new way. She replaced the hierarchy of English language, and is just absolutely brilliant. I know her as a philosopher, and that her friend Alfred North Whitehead was doing process philosophy, but he wasn't doing it. He was describing it in his most obtuse of ways. But Stein was doing it in her work. Of every moment is renewed. Every moment is anew. Every word, you hear it new. That's why she wrote, a rose is a rose is a rose. is a rose. There were 4 of them, because every time the scent would be new, the flower would be new. But Miss Fur and Miss Keen, and I looked at it and I said, oh my goodness. we were looking right at a lesbian tract. I think Miss Fur and Miss Keen. I think Miss Keen ended up leaving Miss Fur at the end of it, so it's a whole love story. And then there's a breakup at the end of it. And nobody knew. No one had a clue that that's what she was talking about. So that would have been my story and my homage to Stein in her exquisite cleverness, to put so much content in and bury it under a new language, so that people were so entranced by the repetition, they never got to the content. And that is how you must approach her work, is to say, I know there is content in here, and it's in the rhythm there somewhere. Let me just try to re-describe myself enough that I can get it, that I can understand it. And once you do that, it's marvelous. She'll be a wellspring for you as well.
And I think, thinking about Stein, and also I'm so glad you brought up Sally Miller Gearhart. And there was this constellation of women who really did tear apart language and put it back together. And I think Sally Miller Gearhart was one of them in the fabulous novel The Wanderground. And June Arnold in The Cook and the Carpenter,
yes.
with this sort of, undoing of gendered language.
Mary Daly.
Mary Daly.
Right.
Marge Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time, which also has this non-gendered pronoun as a part of it, that I think those kinds of, and I think all of them would have read and looked to Stein in this sort of like undoing of the language and the breaking of it, and asking how can it come together in different ways.
Julie, I want to ask you, in your editing work at Sinister Wisdom, you have your thumb on the pulse of what's happening.
Yes.
And does that influence your own work?
I never feel like I have my thumb on the pulse of what's happening. One of the things about me, I mean, maybe I do, like I try to read a lot, and we get a lot of submissions. I think one of the things about being an editor is you never have a sense of, like, to have your thumb on the pulse of something means that you have to be on the front edge. And part of editing, I think, always feels like you're in the hulls at the bottom of the boat, very close to drowning, right? Just because, like, there's just always work and always,
right.
like I feel like I get the cue, especially when I see somebody complaining about editors not responding in a timely way to submissions, so I like go to the, my submission queue and get stuff cleaned out, and like that's the moment when, you should feel kind of like on the front edge, right? But it's also just sort of then tied with this sort of sense of the administrative stuff that comes with editing. But I do think that when I started being editor, a dear writing colleague of mine said, the reason you have to do this is because you, in editing and publishing Sinister Wisdom, you create a context for your own work and for people to see and understand your work. And so I carry that with me, and I try to, and I know when reading and thinking about issues and different things, I know that I gravitate to certain things that speak to me as a writer, and that also then gives me an opportunity to say, all right, so what doesn't speak to me as a writer? Like what are things sort of outside my aesthetic, outside my my sort of core intellectual interest, that where I need to be reaching other people. And so I think it gives me that both opportunities, one to sort of think about a context for my own writing and what I want that to be, and also to really think about like what's super far away from me, and what's going on in other places, and how can I recognize that I don't have the time and attention to really engage in those places maybe as deeply as I want, but I can find guides. And who are those guides who can help me sort of reach people in other spaces?
And are you speaking about an international scene as well as, a contemporary mass culture, but also things that are happening on other continents and so on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like one space, like I think that there's a vibrant sort of in the U.S. context, there's this vibrant lesbian fantasy, all kinds of genre fiction, science fiction, all that kind of stuff. That it's not an area that I read in, but that I'm always looking for guides to help with. And then the international, what's happening for lesbians internationally is fascinating. I've been talking with a group of women in Egypt who are translating Cherie Moraga, Audre Lorde, and Adrienne Rich for women for lesbians in Egypt to read, and so we've been talking. They're doing some Pat Parker translation as well, and I keep saying to them, like I'm happy to ship copies of the journal, and they're all like, we can't receive mail. It's too dangerous, and we can't keep the books with us in our homes. Like we are, we only do papers, photocopied papers of Rich and Lorde and Moraga, because being exposed as holding lesbian things is a physical danger for us. And then there's so many great, in a similar vein, but kind of different contexts in sub-Saharan Africa, the ways that lesbians are reading and translating and connecting with women both within their countries and outside their countries, many in contexts that are incredibly hostile around homosexuality, but that people are able to reach out through the internet and through publishing in those ways are incredibly profound. So, fascinating stuff is happening around the world right now.
Any final questions from anyone or thoughts? Well, I want to thank you two and thank myself. And yay!